In this video, we're going to take a look at different types of angle relationships. We're going to look at 4 different types. So we're going to start off with adjacent angles. If you don't know what the word adjacent means, it means next to. So if you're adjacent to something, you are next to it. So adjacent angles are 2 angles that are next to each other. So if I split this in half and I say angle 1 and angle 2, those 2 angles are right next to each other. So angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. Say I had a third angle coming off of it. We'll call it angle 3 because we're getting creative here. Angle 2 and angle 3 are right next to each other. They share both a point and a side. And that's what it means to be adjacent angles. My next angle type will be complementary angles. Complementary angles are 2 angles that add up, so they have a sum of 90 degrees. So, if you remember, a 90-degree angle is a right angle, and we can split it into 2. And we'll say that this is 35 degrees and this is 55 degrees. So those 2 angles, if I were to add them, would give me 90 degrees, and therefore it is complementary. They don't always have to be attached like that. Sometimes they can be separate, as long as when you put them together, they equal 90. So it could be 45 and 45, not attached. They don't have to be adjacent, but they're still complementary. My next angle type will be supplementary angles. And supplementary angles are equal to 180 degrees. I like to think of it because supplementary starts with an S, so it's on a straight line, which means it is a sum of 180. So one of them could be 35 degrees, and the other could be 145 degrees. So the sum of the 2 of them, if I was to add them together, would be 180 degrees. And just like complementary angles, they don't have to be adjacent. So they could be 2 separate angles that aren't attached. And then lastly, we have our vertical angles. Vertical angles are created by intersecting lines, and they are the angles across from each other. So these 2 angles, we'll call them angles 1 and 4, as well as these 2 angles. Let's try that again. As long as these 2 angles. So we'll call those angles 2 and angles 3. So when they're across from each other like that, they have the same measure. They're equal. So those are the basics of our angle relationships. Now I want to take a look at how to solve when we have missing angles. So we'll start with complementary. You don't really have to solve for adjacent angles for the angle measures. So we'll start with complementary. And remember, complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. So let's say I have an angle that is 20 degrees. We'll keep it simple. And my other is x. To find the angle of the missing measure, I can write an equation because the 2 of them have to add up to 90 degrees. So I can write an equation, x plus 20 is equal to 90. Then to solve, I simply subtract 20 from both sides, and I get x is equal to 70. Now let's make it slightly more complicated. Let's say that one side is x and the other side is x plus, we'll say the other side is 2x. So to find my missing angle, I need to solve an equation. So one measure is x plus my other angle of 2x is going to be equal to 90 degrees. So to solve, I solve it like I would any other equation. I combine my like terms. X plus 2x is 3x. And then I divide by my coefficient. So I divide by 3, and I get that x is equal to 30. Once I know what x is equal to, I can then plug it back in. So if x is equal to 30, that means this is 30. And then 2x, I simply plug in the 30, and 2 times 30 is 60. So that angle measures 60 degrees. If I was to add my two measures together, my 30 degrees and my 60 degrees, I get 90 degrees, and I know I did my work correctly. Let's do one more that is slightly harder for complementary angles, and then we'll move on to supplementary. Let's say we have an angle that is x plus 2, and we have an angle that is 3x plus 1. It's still complementary angles, so we still add up the two measures. So we added the 3x plus 1 and the x plus 2. And then because it's complementary, we set it equal to 90 degrees. We then combine our like terms. 3x plus x is 4x. And 1 plus 2 is 3. We subtract 3 from both sides. And 4x is equal to 87. And then we divide by our coefficient of 4. And we get x is equal to 21.7-ish. So once we know what x is equal to find the angle of our measures, we simply take 3x plus 1 and x plus 2, and we plug in what we got for x. So 21.7 plus 1 and 21.7 plus 2. And using that, we can find the angle of our measures. So that's what we do for complementary angles. Supplementary angles are almost exactly the same. The only difference is we now set them equal to 180. So supplementary angles have a sum of 180 degrees. It's on a straight line. So if we have an angle and we know it is 140 degrees, to find our missing angle, we simply write an equation. 140 plus x is equal to 180. Then to solve, we subtract 140 from both sides, and x is equal to 40 degrees. So that's our missing angle. If we have one slightly harder, where we have to solve something a little more difficult, we'll say 1 is equal to 3x. No, we'll say 1 is equal to 4x. And the other is equal to x. Once again, we take those two measures and we add them. So we do 4x plus x is equal to 180 degrees. And then we solve. We combine our like terms. And then we divide by our coefficient of 5. And we get an answer of x is equal to 36. And then to find our answers for the measures, we simply plug in 36 and solve. So x is equal to 36, so this measure is 36 degrees, and then 36 times 4 is 144, So this measure is 144 degrees. If I was to take these two things and add them together, I would get 180 degrees. And then we'll do one slightly harder, just like we did for complementary, but it's the same exact process. So we'll say that one of them is equal to x plus 1. The other measure is 2x plus 4. Once again, we write an equation where we're adding those two things together, and we set them equal to 180 because we're dealing with supplementary angles. So we combine our like terms. 2x plus x is 3x, and 4 plus 1 is 5. Then we subtract both sides by 5, and we get 3x is equal to 175. Then we divide both sides by 3, and x is going to be equal to 5, 8.3, repeating. So once we know what x is equal to, we simply plug it back in to these two expressions to find the angle of our measures. The last thing we'll look at is vertical angles. So remember, vertical angles are angles across from each other and they are equal. So say I know that this is 110 degrees and this is x. It's simply set them equal to each other. So if one is 110 degrees, so is the other. If it's a little more complicated than that, and I know that one side is equal to 110, and I know that one side is equal to 3x plus 2, and the other is equal to 2x plus 5, I simply set those two equations equal to each other. So 3x plus 2 is equal to 2x plus 5, and I solve. So I subtract my smaller variable from both sides, and I get x plus 2 is equal to 5. And then I bring all of my constants to the other side, and I get x is equal to 3. And then I would plug it in to the expressions, so 3 times 3 plus 2 for this one, and 2 times 3 plus 5 for this one, and it would tell me that my picture number 1 is not very accurate, and number 2, that each of these measures 11 degrees. So all you're doing for vertical angles is setting the two expressions equal to each other in order to solve. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you struggle with solving equations, remember that I did post a video on how to solve equations. That might help you as well for when you're solving for missing angles.